Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the sunlit streets of 17th century New England, where the smell of wood smoke curls around timber-framed houses and the chatter of townsfolk mingles with the bleating of goats and the occasional squawk of a startled chicken. You trudge along uneven cobblestones, feeling the morning dews soak your boots, and notice how every door and shutter seems to whisper a story of authority, of rules written in ink and enforced with a firmness you probably won't survive this reality check. The air carries a peculiar mix of spices, sawdust, and the faint tang of cider, fermenting somewhere down the alley, reminding you that domestic life was both quaint and brutally structured. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to know who's joining us from where, even if only virtually. You pass a small chapel where the minister's voice rises and falls in the morning sermon, each word seemingly reinforcing the social order of the day. Husbands, you realize, are the unquestioned heads of households. Wives are expected to nod, smile and obey, sometimes under the shadow of a wooden rod that could very well rest in the corner, a silent reminder of authority. You notice a neighbor peering through a lattice window, and though their smile is polite, you sense a tacit understanding. Everyone knows the rules, but few speak them aloud. Outside, a child scampers by, imitating the adult rituals of command and obedience, and you can't help but notice the almost ceremonial nature of these early lessons in hierarchy. Historians still argue whether these domestic codes were ever formally codified or just an unwritten expectation stitched into every corner of colonial life. You step into a small home, the rough texture of the wooden floorboards pressing beneath your feet, and the faint aroma of roasted grains and smouldering hearth smoke clinging to the air. The husband, dressed in a plain but tidy coat, moves with a sense of unquestioned authority, while his wife tends to the morning chores with careful precision. A quirky detail catches your eye. A small rod, polished smooth by frequent use, hangs beside the door, part tool, part warning. You notice how each household object seems to signal rank and responsibility. Even the placement of benches and tables subtly reinforces the man's dominance. In one corner, a woven basket holds scraps of parchment with lists, perhaps accounts or reminders, all neat and ordered, mirroring the order expected in behavior. As the morning unfolds, you begin to see the rhythm of life here, the creak of doors, the shuffle of feet, the whispered instructions to children. Life is tactile and immediate, every motion and gesture a reinforcement of authority, and yet there's a peculiar coziness to it, a sense of predictability that might lull an outsider into comfort, until you remember that not all rules are written in ink, and some are enforced with the weight of a hand or the threat of one. You might even notice the distant clatter of a blacksmith's hammer echoing like punctuation in a story of domestic order. And as you take it all in, you realize that colonial mornings are a blend of charm and strict control, a place where authority is both visible and invisible, tangible and whispered, and where the everyday carries with it a tension that might make your modern mind shiver. You follow the narrow path from the bustling market toward the more solemn rows of houses, each framed in dark timber beams that creak faintly as you brush past. There's a sense of order here that runs deeper than morning chores or the alignment of shutters. It's the unspoken, legally reinforced understanding that a husband's word is the final one in his household. You glance at a notice nailed to a post. The faded ink outlines the rule of thumb, a curious phrase that later generations would associate with men's authority to physically correct their wives. Historians still argue whether this rule was ever a formally codified law or simply a tolerated custom, but the sentiment is unmistakable. As you trudge along, the chill of dawn brushing your cheeks, it becomes clear that the law and daily life are intertwined in ways both subtle and stark. Inside one modest home, the husband's hand lingers a moment longer than necessary on a chair to demonstrate control. No words, just gesture and presence. Quirky as it seems, some accounts claim that colonial courts routinely sided with men, even when the correction turned harsher than intended. You imagine the worn wood of benches and tables, polished smooth by generations of hands, standing witness to countless minor punishments disguised as discipline. And in the corner, a cat stretches lazily, indifferent to the human hierarchy, perhaps the only creature immune to the social order. Stepping into the sunlight again, the scent of fresh hay mixes with the earthy aroma of dirt paths, and you hear the distant hum of a blacksmith at work. The law here does not sleep. It is woven into the fabric of everyday life. Town records hint at husbands being cautioned only when their actions were excessive, though the threshold of excess was laughably high. Some fringe reports even suggest that men occasionally carried written licenses or approvals from magistrates, as if to formalize what society already sanctioned. You notice women exchanging subtle glances across fences, perhaps communicating relief, resignation, or quiet resistance. Their eyes speak volumes that the law never acknowledges. As the day progresses, the market stalls fill with scents of roasting grains and fresh-baked bread, and you catch fragments of conversation, a neighbour's hushed warning, a mother's instruction to her children, the faint echo of the church bell reminding everyone of divine oversight. This is a world where legality and morality are entwined, often at the expense of personal safety. And yet, within this framework, families survive, children play, and life carries on. A curious balance of fear, obedience, and faint domestic rhythm. You step carefully along, mindful of the shadows cast by both law and timbered homes, sensing how the legal backing of husbands extends beyond mere authority. It permeates the very air you breathe. The chapel doors creak as you push them open, letting in a thin shaft of morning light that illuminates floating dust motes like tiny golden spectres. The congregation hums quietly, the murmur of prayers mingling with the soft shuffle of feet on worn wooden planks. Here, the pulpit dominates the room, a raised platform where ministers deliver sermons that are equal parts spiritual guidance and societal instruction. You notice the rhythmic rise and fall of the minister's voice, each cadence emphasizing male authority, reminding everyone, especially the women, that obedience is not just expected, it is holy. Quirky as it seems, some ministers kept slender rods polished and gleaming, propped against the pulpit or the pews, serving as constant visual reminders that discipline and divine order went hand in hand. You trudge past the hymn books, their leather covers cracked, pages thin from repeated handling, and feel a subtle chill from the stone floor. Historians still argue whether these visual symbols were intended purely as moral reinforcement, or if they also served as veiled threats, silent guardians of patriarchal dominance. You glance at the women seated together, quietly adjusting their bonnets, whispering behind gloved hands. Perhaps they are exchanging coded stories of resilience, or maybe they are simply imagining the weight of authority pressing down on their lives. Either way, there is an undercurrent of tension beneath the ritualized calm of the service, a quiet acknowledgement that moral and legal structures intersect in ways that are often uncomfortable to contemplate. Exiting into the sunlight, you're immediately hit with the crisp scent of pine and smoke from nearby hearths. The town square buzzes faintly with merchants unpacking goods, children darting between stalls, and dogs barking in the distance. You pause at a wooden sign, its paint faded by sun and rain, advertising a public lecture on moral correction in the household, a phrase that makes your eyebrows lift in both amusement and disbelief. Historians still debate whether such notices were genuinely educational or merely performative, reinforcing norms that everyone was already expected to follow. You catch a glimpse of a man polishing a rod in his front yard, a subtle, almost comical reenactment of what you just witnessed in the chapel, the line between spiritual and domestic discipline blurring into a quiet, persistent reminder of who holds the power. As the morning wanes, the scent of baking bread and boiling ale blends with the earthy aroma of the town's square, creating an oddly comforting sensory tapestry. And yet beneath it, there is a tangible tension, a recognition that life here is governed as much by unspoken social codes as by written laws. You trudge along the dusty streets, feeling the rough stones underfoot, noting the subtle choreography of authority in every household doorway, every bowed head, every gloved hand adjusting a bonnet. The interplay of church, law, and daily life leaves a lingering sense that control here is both seen and unseen, enforced with gentle suggestion and the occasional firm gesture. You wander down a narrow lane, lined with timber-framed homes whose walls seem to lean slightly inward, as if sharing whispers about the lives contained within. The scent of freshly churned butter mixes with the faint tang of smoke from clay hearths, creating a cozy, deceptively innocent atmosphere. Inside these homes, the domestic hierarchy is palpable. Every object, from the height of the table to the placement of chairs, signals authority. You trudge carefully over worn floorboards, noting the precise alignment of kitchen utensils and the polished wooden handles of tools hanging in plain sight. Historians still argue whether interior design intentionally reinforced patriarchal control or simply reflected practical living arrangements, but the effect is unmistakable. Everything subtly whispers who is in charge. The wife moves about quietly, her fingers deftly arranging a pile of chopped kindling beside the hearth while keeping one ear tuned to her husband's movements. You notice a small wooden rod propped against the wall. A fringe tidbit suggests some households used it not only for discipline, but also as a playful training device for children, teaching them early lessons in obedience through mimicry. There's a rhythm to the home, a choreography of compliance, sweep, stir, fetch, kneel, bow, nod. Even the youngest children echo these movements, their small hands imitating grown-ups, absorbing the unspoken codes of power. Step into the sunlight pouring through the latticed windows, and you feel the subtle tension between comfort and control. You see the husband sitting at a simple oak desk, ledger open, pen poised, a figure of authority blending commerce and command. Some scholars debate whether this domestic choreography was a product of necessity or a deliberate performance of social dominance. Outside, the faint chatter of neighbors carries over fences, hints of gossip weaving in and out of the fragrant morning air. Occasionally, a glance exchanged between women speaks volumes, an unspoken conversation about endurance, survival, and the subtle ways of navigating authority. As you continue along the lane, the scent of hay from nearby stables mingles with that of boiling porridge, and you notice small gardens meticulously tended, plants arranged in rows that mirror the order enforced within the home. Quirky as it seems, some accounts claim that these garden layouts were used to subtly reinforce lessons in obedience and submission, the very act of tending plants becoming an allegory for societal order. You trudge past, noting the way sunlight hits the timber walls, the way shadows bend across doorways, and you realize that the domestic hierarchy is not only maintained by words or rods, but also through constant, pervasive cues embedded in the very structure of everyday life. It's subtle, relentless, and strangely hypnotic, the kind of background hum of authority that seeps into every corner of existence. You cross the small wooden bridge, spanning a trickling creek, the water's soft gurgle blending with the distant clatter of a blacksmith hammering iron, a rhythm both comforting and authoritative. The town beyond hums with early morning activity, children chasing chickens and merchants arranging wares on tables, but your attention keeps drifting back to the homes lining the street, to the subtle signals of authority in every doorway. The husband emerges, coat buttoned neatly, hands dusted with sawdust from morning repairs, and you notice the faint gleam of a small rod tucked into his belt. Historians still debate whether these implements were used widely or only in cases of extreme disobedience, but in every account, their presence is unmistakable. Inside one home, a wife kneels by the hearth, scrubbing the blackened stone with rhythmic precision. A quirky detail catches your eye. The family cat, perched on a low shelf, watches the scene as if judging the choreography of domestic life. The rod, polished smooth from repeated use, rests within arm's reach, a silent reminder that law and authority are never far away. You notice the way the children move cautiously, learning early which behaviors are acceptable and which draw a sharp word or a flick of the hand. Every glance, every gesture is calibrated. Obedience is taught as naturally as tying shoelaces, almost without thought. Stepping outside, the faint scent of bread baking in a neighbor's oven mingles with the earthy aroma of damp soil, creating an oddly comforting contrast to the underlying tension. You watch as men gather briefly in the square, exchanging greetings, nods, and perhaps unspoken agreements about who is responsible for maintaining order at home. Scholars still argue whether the social expectation of male authority was genuinely internalized or enforced mainly through performative acts and legal backing. You notice a mother nudging her child along, her expression patient, yet tinged with caution, a subtle dance of nurturing within boundaries set by unseen but omnipresent rules. As noon approaches, the shadows lengthen and the air warms, carrying hints of smoked meat and roasted grains. You pass a low wooden fence where women gather, their conversation soft and quick, sharing stories that never reach the ears of husbands or magistrates. Some fringe accounts suggest these moments of clandestine communication were pivotal in maintaining a sense of agency amidst pervasive control. You trudge on, noticing the rhythm of domestic life reflected in the mundane, the alignment of broomsticks, the way chairs are tucked under tables, the careful placement of ladles in the kitchen. It's a world where authority is embroidered into the fabric of everyday actions, a silent yet persistent force shaping every motion, every glance, every breath. You follow the winding path toward the edge of town, where the clatter of wagons blends with the soft rustle of leaves in the late afternoon breeze. The houses here are slightly larger, framed in sturdy oak beams, with thatched roofs that smell faintly of smoke and rain. You notice a husband tending a small garden, the hoe moving in precise, deliberate arcs, as if the act of cultivating vegetables mirrors the cultivation of control within his household. Historians still argue whether this spatial discipline in home layouts was incidental or a subtle form of reinforcing male authority. The air carries a comforting warmth, yet beneath it hums a persistent tension, the kind that you feel in your chest before you even see the cause. Inside one of the homes, the wife is arranging herbs on a wooden shelf above the hearth, their earthy aroma mingling with the scent of simmering broth. A quirky detail emerges. Some households kept a small bell beside the hearth, a simple mechanism to summon the husband or signal readiness for inspection, merging practicality with psychological reinforcement. You notice the children quietly watching, mimicking gestures, internalizing the household codes with astonishing efficiency. Every glance and movement within the room is a subtle negotiation of authority and obedience, a quiet ballet that everyone knows the steps to, even if they sometimes falter. Stepping into the sunlight streaming through a latticed window, you catch the glint of a polished rod leaning against the wall, its smooth surface catching the golden light. Outside, the faint murmur of neighbors discussing town news drifts over fences. Some fringe historical accounts claim that the rod, though ostensibly a tool for discipline, also functioned as a social signal. The polished wood suggested diligence and readiness, a subtle reminder to others of the man's authority within and beyond his household. Historians still debate whether the legal toleration of domestic correction truly reflected societal consensus or merely codified a reality few dared contest. As the afternoon unfolds, the smells of baked bread and roasting meat mingle with the earthy aroma of damp timber, creating a sensory tapestry that is at once comforting and quietly oppressive. You notice the rhythm of domestic life, a wife kneading dough with methodical precision, children playing quietly in the corner, a husband reviewing accounts with an air of unspoken command. Even in the gentle creak of floorboards and the faint scent of herbs, the assertion of authority resonates. And as you trudge along the cobblestones back toward the town square, you sense the pervasive nature of these norms, woven into walls, whispered in glances, embedded in daily routines, and subtly reinforced by the laws that back them, a persistent hum under the veneer of quaint colonial life. The sun dips lower, casting long amber shadows across the cobblestone streets, and you feel the evening air grow cooler, carrying the faint scent of smoke from hearths and the metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge. You pause outside a modest home where the wooden shutters are half closed, the golden light inside hinting at domestic routines quietly unfolding. Inside, the husband sits at the table, ledger open, quill poised, a figure of calm authority. The wife moves silently between tasks, her hands busy with sewing, chopping, and arranging, every gesture fluid yet measured. Historians still argue whether the physical aspect of marital discipline was more symbolic than punitive, yet the societal expectation is undeniable. Control is demonstrated, observed, and maintained. A quirky detail catches your eye. Near the hearth, a small wooden figure of a man stands, its arms raised as if giving instruction or delivering correction. Some accounts suggest that these miniature figures served as a playful, almost absurd reminder of authority, particularly when children were present, blending domestic teaching with subtle psychological reinforcement. The children move carefully, aware of the silent cues, internalizing lessons in obedience almost as naturally as they learn to tie their shoes. You notice a cat weaving between their feet, its slow, deliberate movements contrasting sharply with the precise choreography of human behavior. Outside, the air is filled with the faint murmur of neighbors closing shops, calling children to supper, and exchanging whispered town news. You catch fragments of conversation about recent disputes, minor debts, and the occasional reprimand from magistrates, a backdrop of social surveillance that mirrors the household control within each home. Scholars still debate whether these societal norms were enforced primarily through legal backing, social expectation, or a mixture of both, but the effect is clear. Obedience is both codified and performed. As twilight deepens, the smells of baking bread, simmering stew, and fresh pine mingle with the faint crispness of evening air. The houses, with their timber beams and thatched roofs, cast long shadows across the street, emphasizing the rhythm of domestic order. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully positioned object is a subtle reminder of hierarchy, reinforcing control in a quiet, almost hypnotic way. Even in the lull between chores, the pervasive hum of authority lingers, a constant companion threading through the mundane textures of colonial life. You trudge past, the soft crunch of gravel beneath your feet echoing like the whisper of laws, expectations, and centuries-old customs that define every corner of this world. The evening sky deepens into muted shades of indigo, and a gentle breeze carries the mingled scents of damp earth and wood smoke from distant hearths. You wander along the narrow lanes, noticing how the subtle glow of lanterns flickers against the timber-framed houses. Inside one home, a husband sharpens a small rod on a whetstone, the rhythmic, rasping sound echoing softly against the walls. Historians still debate whether these implements were intended primarily for discipline, ritual, or a combination of both, but their presence underscores the omnipresence of authority in domestic life. You notice the wife arranging plates on the table, each movement careful and deliberate, as if choreographed to maintain harmony and avoid any hint of disobedience. A quirky detail emerges from the corner of the room. A small clay whistle, painted in bright colors, hangs near the hearth. Some accounts suggest it was used to signal minor infractions or to summon family members, blending practicality with a subtle reinforcement of order. The children peek from behind doorways, eyes wide, learning early that the boundaries of acceptable behavior are both invisible and rigid, a quiet education in compliance. You trudge across the creaking floorboards, feeling the soft give beneath your weight, each step a reminder that domestic spaces are carefully structured arenas of power. Outside, the town settles into a gentle hum of evening activity. Neighbors exchange quiet greetings, their voices low, to avoid disturbing the routines within homes. You notice a small wooden sign outside a tavern, advertising a lecture on household management and moral duty, its wording oddly formal for a casual evening gathering. Scholars still argue whether these notices were earnest educational attempts or performative gestures to reinforce societal norms. The soft rustle of leaves and distant laughter contrasts with the invisible weight of expectation pressing into every home, every hallway, every hearth. As night deepens, the aroma of roasted meat and baking bread melds with the earthy scent of damp timber, creating a sensory backdrop that is both comforting and subtly oppressive. You pause to observe a wife tending a small hearth fire, her movement steady, methodical, each gesture reinforcing the rhythm of obedience. Outside, the wind carries whispers of children playing, dogs barking, and the occasional clatter of a late errand, a gentle reminder that life continues beyond the invisible boundaries of control. In this delicate interplay of light, scent, and sound, authority is both everywhere and unseen, embedded in daily routines and quietly taught lessons. You trudge on, absorbing the patterns of colonial life, sensing how every choice, every gesture, every object participates in the subtle orchestration of power. The moon rises pale and silver over the rooftops, casting a soft glow that stretches long shadows across the cobblestones. You step carefully over uneven stones, the night air carrying hints of pine, smoke, and damp earth. In one home, the husband leans back in a sturdy chair, quill set aside, surveying his domain with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows his authority is unquestioned. Historians still argue whether this patriarchal presence was maintained more by law or by subtle psychological reinforcement, but either way, the household breathes a rhythm of expectation and obedience. Inside, the wife moves with silent efficiency, tending a simmering pot of broth while glancing occasionally toward the door, ensuring that everything remains in order. A quirky detail sits on the mantel, a carved wooden cat with an exaggeratedly stern expression, said in some accounts to serve as a symbolic guardian of propriety and good behavior. You watch the children, their small hands mimicking the precise movements of their parents, unknowingly internalizing the codes of domestic hierarchy with every sweep of the broom, every careful placement of utensils. Outside, the faint murmur of nocturnal life drifts from neighboring houses. Some scholars suggest that the combination of legal authority and constant social surveillance created an environment in which discipline was both anticipated and enacted almost automatically. The smell of freshly baked bread lingers faintly, mingling with the metallic tang of iron tools stored near the hearth, a sensory reminder that domestic life is a blend of care, sustenance, and subtle enforcement. You notice a narrow hallway where the wooden floor creaks under each step. Some fringe accounts mentioned that certain homes had strategically placed boards that would reveal a sound if a child moved incorrectly or a wife hesitated, a simple yet effective mechanism for reinforcing attentiveness. The night hums with a delicate tension, the soft rustle of curtains and the distant bark of a dog punctuating the quiet order of the household. Every glance, every gesture, every scent seems laden with meaning, a gentle but persistent echo of control threading through the domestic world. As you walk past, you feel that even in the calm of night, the invisible choreography of authority remains alive, a quiet performance rehearsed and refined across generations. Dawn creeps in slowly, brushing the thatched roofs with pale gold, and you trudge along a narrow lane where the morning fog clings low to the ground. The scent of wet soil and smoke drifts from chimneys, mingling with the faint sweetness of wildflowers edging the road. Inside a modest home, the husband sharpens his tools while the wife tends the hearth, her movements fluid yet deliberate. Historians still debate whether these early morning routines were practical necessity or subtle performances of authority, but either way, they reinforce the rhythm of control that pervades every corner of colonial domestic life. A quirky detail makes you pause. A small wooden duck, carved with exaggerated wings and a stern expression, sits on a shelf near the door. Some fringe accounts suggest these little figures were thought to carry symbolic authority, almost as silent witnesses to obedience, reminding both children and adults of the invisible rules that govern behavior. You watch the children tiptoe past, careful not to disturb the carefully arranged household, their awareness already tuned to the subtle cues of hierarchy. Every gesture, the way a broom is placed against a wall, the alignment of chairs, even the folding of cloth, speaks of order, expectation, and discipline. Outside, the faint clatter of a wagon echoes along the cobblestones, mingling with the soft cooing of doves in the square. Scholars still argue whether the legal frameworks allowing husbands to correct their wives were more a reflection of societal norms or a tool to institutionalize domestic control. But the presence of authority is undeniable. You notice a neighbor's wife exchanging a few whispered words with another, their conversation brief and cautious, a subtle negotiation of autonomy within the constraints imposed by law and custom. As the morning sun warms the timbered houses, the smell of bread baking and firewood fills the air, a comforting contrast to the ever-present undertones of expectation. The husband steps outside to tend a small garden, each movement purposeful, every glance suggesting awareness of his role as both provider and enforcer. The wife adjusts a kettle over the hearth, her hands steady, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the door as if measuring readiness against invisible benchmarks. You trudge past, noting the interplay of light, scent, and subtle power that shapes every routine. Even the soft morning breeze seems to carry lessons in obedience, whispering through shutters, stirring curtains, and threading itself into the very fabric of colonial life. The morning has fully arrived now, golden light spilling across rooftops and glinting off the brass hinges of doors. You walk past a small square where a few merchants are setting up their stalls, the scents of fresh herbs and smoked meats weaving together in a dizzying but comforting perfume. Inside one home, a husband sits at a rough-hewn table, quill in hand, reviewing accounts from the day before. His presence dominates the room, not through loud commands, but through quiet, unspoken authority. Historians still debate whether this dominance was primarily psychological or legally enforced, but either way, it permeates the domestic atmosphere. A quirky artifact draws your attention, a miniature painted shield hung above the fireplace, displaying a heroic scene of knights and valor. Fringe accounts suggest that families often use such items as subtle reminders of societal ideals and hierarchical structures, teaching children early on to respect authority figures, even if those figures were merely symbolic. You notice the wife moving around the kitchen, her gestures precise, a gentle but consistent choreography that sustains household order. The children peek from behind corners, eyes wide and attentive, mimicking behaviors that they may not even fully understand yet, internalizing rules and expectations with astonishing subtlety. Outside, the clatter of wagon wheels and the murmur of townsfolk exchanging greetings forms a soft, almost hypnotic rhythm. Scholars still argue whether these norms surrounding domestic authority were rooted in practical necessity, moral philosophy, or legal codification, but the effect is undeniable. Obedience and structure weave themselves into the fabric of daily life. You notice a neighbor's dog sniffing along a fence line, oblivious to the tension and careful choreography unfolding in human households nearby, yet somehow part of the sensory tapestry of order. The smell of fresh bread, roasting meat, and damp earth mingles with the faint metallic tang of iron tools leaning against the walls. You pause at a low fence where women gather, whispering quietly as children play nearby. Some fringe accounts claim that these whispered exchanges were crucial for maintaining subtle agency within constrained domestic spheres, tiny acts of negotiation and resistance hidden beneath layers of expectation. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully placed object communicates an unspoken language of hierarchy and discipline. And as you trudge onward, the rhythm of colonial life hums softly around you, shaping not just homes, but hearts, and the quiet understanding of what it means to live under constant, almost invisible, oversight. By late morning, the town has settled into a gentle hum, the rhythmic clatter of cartwheels, the distant bleat of sheep, and the soft murmur of neighbors exchanging news. You follow the narrow alleyways, feeling the cobblestones underfoot and inhaling the mix of smoke, fresh earth, and baking bread. Inside one home, a husband adjusts a small ledger, his fingers moving with practiced precision, each mark of the quill asserting order, control, and accountability. Historians still debate whether this constant vigilance was more psychological than physical, but the subtle power dynamics are unmistakable. A quirky object catches your eye near the hearth, a small, intricately carved wooden mouse perched on the mantel. Some fringe accounts suggest these tiny carvings were intended as silent witnesses, a playful yet pointed reminder to family members to follow the rules. The wife glances at it almost subconsciously, her hands steady as she kneads dough or tends the fire, movements flowing into a ritual of obedience. Children tiptoe nearby, learning by observation that every gesture counts, that even minor infractions could ripple through the household, a living lesson in hierarchy and consequence. Outside, the faint scent of lavender from window boxes mingles with smoke and the earthy aroma of wet stone, a sensory backdrop to the subtle choreography of colonial life. Scholars still argue whether legal allowances for husbands to correct their wives merely codified existing behavior or actively encouraged stricter domestic discipline. But the laws linger in the shadows of every room, every hearth, and every glance exchanged between family members. You notice a neighbor's rooster crowing insistently, its call cutting through the quiet routine, almost like a reminder that life continues beyond the constraints of domestic order, yet always within the larger framework of societal expectation. The husband steps toward the door, checking the fence line, his gaze sweeping over the small yard and the surrounding cottages. The wife adjusts a kettle over the hearth, eyes flicking toward the doorway, her movements simultaneously graceful and cautious. The children continue their careful play, mirroring behaviors learned from parents, while the cat slinks through shadows, indifferent yet entirely a part of the domestic rhythm. Every creak of a floorboard, every soft clink of utensils, every scent that rises from the hearth contributes to a living, breathing orchestra of order, subtly reinforcing the delicate balance of authority that defines this colonial world. You trudge on, sensing the invisible threads of control weaving through walls, air, and daily routines, a quiet but persistent testament to the power of law, custom, and expectation. The afternoon sun slants through small, leaded windows, scattering fragmented patterns across the worn floorboards. You wander past gardens fragrant with thyme and rosemary, the aroma mingling with the distant smoke of bread ovens and the faint tang of iron tools resting against walls. Inside a home, a husband leans against a sturdy table, reviewing notes with the quiet authority of someone whose word carries invisible weight. Historians still debate whether his role as enforcer of domestic discipline was primarily legal, moral, or psychological, but you can feel the unspoken tension threading through the room. A quirky detail draws your attention, a tiny painted figurine of a stern-faced magistrate perched above the fireplace. Some accounts suggest these whimsical objects served as silent reminders of both societal and legal oversight, a subtle reinforcement of hierarchy that seems almost comical, yet oddly effective. The wife moves through the room with a deliberate rhythm, tending the hearth, folding linens, adjusting a kettle. Even the children are attuned to this cadence, their small gestures careful, mimicking the behaviors that structure their world. You notice the family cat weaving through the scene, its languid movements in stark contrast to the rigid domestic choreography, yet somehow part of the subtle lesson in obedience and awareness. Outside, the gentle murmur of neighbors carries through the open windows. A quiet conversation here, the scraping of a wagon wheel there, and the occasional bark of a dog. Scholars still argue whether the domestic authority that allowed husbands to correct their wives was more a product of societal expectation or explicit legal sanction, but either way, its influence is pervasive. You catch a glimpse of a nearby window where another wife quietly arranges herbs on a shelf, her movements mirroring those in the home you just passed, a synchronized dance of order across the street. The smells of roasting meat and baked bread mingle with the earthy perfume of gardens, creating an almost hypnotic sensory tapestry. You watch the husband step outside, checking a fence post, surveying the yard with a quiet vigilance. The wife adjusts the kettle, her eyes briefly meeting his gaze, a subtle acknowledgement of the invisible contract that governs their shared space. Even in this calm, the weight of expectations, laws, and societal norms hums gently in every gesture, every glance, every creak of floorboard. As you trudge along the narrow streets, the soft afternoon light illuminating timbered walls and cobblestone paths, it becomes clear that the balance of authority, discipline, and domestic routine is woven into the very air. a pervasive rhythm that shapes life in ways both subtle and enduring. The late afternoon light filters through gauzy curtains, painting soft stripes across the floorboards. You trudge along a narrow lane where the scent of damp stone and freshly cut wood mingles with the faint, sweet aroma of drying herbs hanging from windowsills. Inside a home, the husband adjusts a ledger, fingers tracing the careful lines of accounts and schedules. Historians still debate whether the legal allowances for husbands to correct their wives were primarily intended to preserve social order or reinforce patriarchal control, but the effect is tangible, palpable, embedded in every corner of domestic life. A quirky detail catches your eye. A small, painted wooden hand hangs on the wall, fingers pointing down as if ready to wag at misbehavior. Some fringe accounts suggest these objects were used almost like domestic talismans, silently reminding family members of expected decorum, a touch of whimsy masking a serious lesson. You watch the wife as she moves through the kitchen, every gesture precise, stirring a pot, folding cloth, wiping a surface, her body language calibrated to maintain harmony and avoid subtle censure. Children peek from behind doorways, learning by imitation that compliance and attentiveness are rewarded, or at least expected, a quiet education in hierarchy. Outside, the town hums softly with the rhythm of late-day activity. A wagon creaks along uneven stones, a dog barks from a distant yard, neighbors exchange hushed greetings over fences. Scholars still argue whether these domestic routines, so heavily codified in law and custom, were more a reflection of moral expectation or pragmatic necessity, but walking past you can see the invisible scaffolding of authority shaping each household. A faint smell of roasting meat drifts from a nearby hearth, mingling with the earthy aroma of wooden beams warming in the sun. The husband steps toward the door, surveying the yard with quiet vigilance. The wife adjusts a kettle over the fire, her eyes flicking briefly toward the window as though measuring the day's passage against invisible standards. Children mimic the motions of their elders, small hands sweeping the floor, arranging objects with deliberate care. Even the family cat pads silently along the edges, a witness to the rhythm of domestic order. You trudge on, absorbing the subtle interplay of law, expectation, and daily routine. The quiet choreography of control that threads through every home, every gesture, every smell, creating a persistent, almost hypnotic structure that defines life in these colonial streets. The sun begins its slow descent, spilling amber light across timbered rooftops and casting long, softened shadows along the cobblestones. You trudge past gardens, heavy with the scent of herbs and flowers, inhaling the mingling aromas of smoke, damp earth, and freshly baked bread. Inside one home, a husband leans against a sturdy chair, quill set aside, eyes scanning over notes and ledgers, as if measuring the household's order, with a silent, exacting gaze. Historians still debate whether the legal allowances for husbands to correct their wives reflected practical necessity, or were more about reinforcing patriarchal power, but the atmosphere of quiet authority is unmistakable. A quirky artifact draws your attention near the hearth, a small painted wooden owl, its wide eyes staring intently. Fringe accounts suggest such objects were used to symbolically monitor behavior, a gentle yet persistent reminder of societal expectations, almost like a tiny, silent hall monitor. The wife moves methodically around the room, tending to the fire, folding laundry, adjusting kitchenware, her movements precise yet fluid. Children observe, wide-eyed, absorbing the subtleties of the household hierarchy. The way a broom is placed, how chairs are aligned, even the folding of linens becomes a lesson in obedience. Outside, the murmurs of neighbors drift through open windows. A soft conversation here, the scraping of a cart there, the occasional crow of a rooster cutting through the quiet. Scholars still argue whether the domestic authority that allowed husbands to discipline their wives was codified law or an extension of customary practice, but the patterns of behavior speak louder than statutes. A neighbor's wife glances across the street, sharing a brief nod with another, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding and silent negotiation under the ever-present gaze of male authority. The aroma of roasting meat mingles with the earthy fragrance of the garden, creating a rich sensory tapestry. The husband steps outside, surveying the yard with deliberate care. The wife adjusts a pot over the hearth, her movements measured, eyes flicking toward the doorway with quiet awareness. Children mimic these gestures, internalizing lessons of attention and responsibility, while the family cat slinks along the edges, indifferent yet part of the rhythm. Every creak of floorboards, every soft clink of utensils, every waft of scent contributes to an invisible web of control and routine. As you trudge onward, the evening light softens the town, yet the delicate balance of law, expectation, and domestic discipline threads through every gesture, every glance, every scent, an invisible but ever-present force shaping life in this colonial world. Twilight settles softly over the town, the sky a wash of deep indigo streaked with fading gold, and you trudge along streets where shadows stretch long and merge with the soft glow of lanterns. The smell of damp stone, wood smoke, and baked bread lingers, mingling with faint floral scents from carefully tended window boxes. Inside one home, the husband sits in quiet reflection, ledger closed, hands resting on the table, as if absorbing the weight of authority itself. Historians still debate whether this authority, legally sanctioned, socially reinforced, or a mix of both, shaped households more through fear, routine, or psychological subtlety, but the result is the same. Order permeates every corner. A quirky detail catches your eye, a tiny, hand-painted star hanging above the fireplace, slightly crooked, as if leaning in to observe the family. Fringe accounts suggest such decorations served as reminders of vigilance and moral oversight, little symbols that reinforced behavior without a single spoken word. The wife moves fluidly through the space, tending the hearth, folding linens, checking the evening meal, her gestures precise yet graceful, a quiet ballet of domestic duty. Children peek from doorways, imitating her motions with reverent caution, learning early the rhythms and expectations embedded in their household. Outside, the murmur of neighbors continues, soft footsteps on cobblestones, the gentle creak of wagon wheels, and the occasional cluck of a distant hen. Scholars still argue whether colonial legal frameworks allowing husbands to correct their wives' codified pre-existing behaviors or actively encouraged stricter domestic discipline, but the influence is undeniable. You notice a neighbor's wife pausing to exchange whispered words with another, a subtle act of camaraderie and quiet negotiation in a world where autonomy is circumscribed. The smells of roasting meat, warmed bread, and the earthy scent of the garden mingle with the soft amber glow of lanterns, creating a sensory cocoon. The husband steps outside to inspect the yard, hands behind his back, eyes sweeping over the household and neighboring homes. The wife tends the fire, glancing toward the door with practiced awareness, her movements both cautious and deliberate. Children quietly mimic the motions of their elders, while the cat slinks along the edges, weaving through shadows as if tracing the invisible lines of authority. Every creak of floorboards, every clink of cooking utensils, every waft of scent threads together into a subtle orchestra of control, expectation, and domestic rhythm. As you trudge onward, the soft glow of twilight highlights the delicate interplay of law, custom, and household hierarchy, a persistent hum threading through the heart of colonial life. Night falls fully, blanketing the town in a gentle hush. You trudge past shuttered windows and narrow alleyways, the cobblestones cold beneath your feet, the air scented with smoke from hearths, and the faint sweetness of night-blooming flowers. Inside a home, the husband leans back in his chair, the glow of a single candle tracing his features, ledger closed but mind still alert. Historians still debate whether the legal powers granted to husbands were more about maintaining social cohesion or about enforcing dominance, but their presence is unmistakable, felt in the very rhythm of daily life. A quirky artifact on the mantel, a small, hand-carved horse with a tiny painted bridle, catches your eye. Fringe accounts suggest such carvings were intended to embody vigilance or act as silent observers, subtly reinforcing obedience without a single word. The wife moves carefully through the room, tidying up the hearth, arranging utensils, smoothing cloth, each motion deliberate, her body language a language of its own, signaling attentiveness and respect for invisible boundaries. Children, now quieter and sleepy-eyed, mirror her gestures, learning early that every action is observed, every misstep potentially noted, however subtly. Outside, the town is wrapped in a soft nocturnal chorus, distant hoots of owls, the muted shuffle of a dog along the lane, the occasional creak of a gate swinging in the night breeze. Scholars still argue whether the legal allowance for husbands to correct their wives was enforced rigorously or existed more as a symbolic reinforcement of gender hierarchy, yet every household seems to resonate with the unspoken rules, each gesture, glance, and sigh tethered to societal expectation. The hearth sends up a comforting glow, mixing with the faint fragrance of herbs hanging near the window. The husband rises to check the lock on the door, hands brushing the cool wood, while the wife places the final touches on the evening chores, eyes flicking toward him with a practiced blend of awareness and deference. Children curl into bed, imitating the lessons of the day in miniature motions and whispered remembrances, while the cat pads silently through the shadows, a quiet observer of domestic order. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft clink of utensils, every waft of wood smoke weaves together, threading law, expectation, and routine into an invisible tapestry. As you trudge onward under the moon's pale glow, it becomes clear that this subtle choreography of authority, vigilance, and household discipline is as pervasive as the night itself, guiding life in ways both seen and unseen. The clock tower chimes faintly, its echo drifting over rooftops and empty streets as you trudge past shuttered doors and glimmering lanterns. The night air carries the mingled scents of damp stone, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of evening flowers from window boxes. Inside a modest home, the husband paces briefly, fingers brushing the edge of the table, ledger set aside, mind cataloguing every detail of the household's order. Historians still debate whether the legal allowances for husbands to correct their wives were intended as practical guidance or as an instrument of patriarchal power, yet the rhythm of authority is woven seamlessly into daily life. A quirky detail draws your attention, a small clay bell hanging near the hearth, unringed but carefully polished. Some fringe sources suggest these bells symbolized attention and vigilance, almost like silent reminders of who controlled the domestic tempo. The wife moves with deliberate grace, tending the dying embers, folding laundry, adjusting cooking pots, each gesture measured, every motion a subtle acknowledgement of the household hierarchy. Children peek from the corner, copying the movements of their elders with careful attention, learning that compliance is a language in itself and that even small deviations are noted by watchful eyes. Outside, the soft murmur of neighbors threads through the night, a distant cough, the scrape of a wagon wheel on cobblestones, the occasional yelp of a dog. Scholars still argue whether the presence of such domestic authority created a sense of stability or fostered underlying tension, but the invisible influence is undeniable. Across the street, another wife pauses in her chores, exchanging a subtle nod with her neighbor, a quiet affirmation of shared experience and mutual recognition under the omnipresent structure of male oversight. The scent of herbs and baking mingles with the cool night air, creating a sensory tapestry that soothes while subtly reminding you of daily rituals and their social underpinnings. The husband steps outside to check a latch on the gate, his gaze sweeping the yard with quiet diligence. The wife attends to the final touches on her domestic duties, eyes flicking toward him in practiced deference. Children curl into bed, mimicking the lessons they've internalized, while the family cat pads through shadows, tracing the invisible lines of order. Every soft creak, every faint clink, every waft of wood smoke threads together law, expectation, and routine, and as you trudge onward under the moon's pale silver, the rhythm of colonial domestic life hums gently, omnipresent, and quietly binding all its inhabitants in shared, inescapable choreography. A thin mist rises from the cobblestones, curling around lantern posts and slipping through narrow alleyways as you trudge past the quiet facades of colonial homes. The scent of damp wood, faint smoke, and lingering bread crusts drifts from doorways, mingling with the occasional floral hint from a neighbor's window box. Inside one such home, the husband stands by a shuttered window, hands resting on the sill, eyes surveying the yard and the muted movements of the household. Historians still debate whether these legal allowances for husbands to administer domestic correction were primarily protective, practical, or a mere codification of male dominance, yet the subtle authority they embodied shapes everything you observe. A quirky object catches your eye, a tiny painted fox perched on a shelf, eyes wide, tail curled delicately around its paws. Fringe accounts suggest these figures served as silent guardians, little talismans of vigilance that reminded household members of expected conduct without a single word being spoken. The wife moves deftly around the kitchen, attending to the remaining chores, folding linens, smoothing surfaces, placing utensils in precise alignment. Each motion is a lesson in attentiveness and unspoken conversation with authority. Children peek from behind door frames, learning the rhythm of their environment, understanding that compliance is both expected and quietly monitored. Outside, the town hums softly. The distant clop of a horse, a dog's muted bark, a wagon creaking slowly over the uneven street. Scholars still argue whether the presence of these domestic legal allowances fostered genuine household stability, or whether they simply reinforced subtle tension, yet the patterns of behavior are unmistakable. Across the lane, a neighbor's wife exchanges a brief glance with another, a quiet nod acknowledging shared experience and the invisible web of authority woven through their lives. The smell of the hearth smoke blends with cool night air, creating a comforting yet persistent reminder of routine and expectation. The husband steps back from the window, eyes sweeping over the yard with quiet vigilance. The wife finishes tending the final embers, adjusting a kettle with precision, her gaze flicking toward him as though measuring satisfaction in silence. Children settle into their beds, imitating motions learned through observation, while the family cat moves silently, weaving between shadows and furniture, tracing the invisible lines of hierarchy. Every creak of floorboards, every faint clink of utensils, every breath of smoke and mist threads together law, custom, and daily practice. And as you trudge through the night air, the soft cadence of authority hums through the colonial world, a presence as persistent and subtle as the mist curling around the lanterns. A pale moon rises over the rooftops, silvering the edges of chimneys and glinting off dewy cobblestones as you trudge through the quiet streets. The cool night air carries the faint scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, mingling with the subtle sweetness of night-blooming flowers tucked into window boxes. Inside a dimly lit home, the husband leans casually against a table, fingers tracing the carved edge, eyes observing the subtle rhythms of his household. Historians still argue whether these legally sanctioned allowances for husbands to discipline wives were intended to protect families, reinforce social norms, or simply solidify male dominance, but the influence is tangible, woven into the fabric of domestic life. A quirky item sits on a shelf nearby, a tiny porcelain rabbit, its ears perked, eyes wide. Fringe accounts suggest such figurines were used as symbolic reminders of attentiveness, almost like a household's conscience in miniature. The wife moves methodically around the room, stoking the fire, folding linens, adjusting dishes, each motion precise and deliberate. Children watch quietly from doorways, practicing the lessons of obedience through mimicked gestures, learning early that the rhythm of the household is as much about subtle cues as it is about overt instruction. Outside, the town whispers softly. The distant bark of a dog, the scraping of a wagon over cobblestones, a faint shuffle of boots on stone. Scholars still debate whether these domestic legal structures created stability or quietly fostered tension, yet their presence is felt in every gesture, glance, and sound. Across the street, a neighbor's wife glances toward her neighbor, sharing a subtle nod of solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement of shared circumstance under the gaze of male authority. The aroma of herbs and lingering hearth smoke mixes with the chill of evening, forming a sensory tapestry that is both comforting and subtly enforcing of routine. The husband steps toward the door, hands brushing the frame, his gaze sweeping over yard and home. The wife adjusts a pot over the hearth, eyes flicking toward him with practiced awareness, her movements both respectful and efficient. Children nestle into bed, recalling the day's subtle lessons, while the family cat slinks silently among shadows, a quiet participant in the choreography of authority. Every creak of the floorboards, every clink of utensils, every waft of smoke threads law, expectation, and domestic rhythm together. And as you trudge beneath the moon's soft glow, the quiet cadence of colonial life hums around you, subtle yet unyielding. The night deepens, drawing a velvety darkness over the town, and you trudge along narrow lanes where the occasional lantern casts soft, trembling pools of light. The air smells faintly of damp stone, soot from hearths, and a hint of lavender from windowsill sachets, a calm mingling with the persistent order that defines each home. Inside one household, the husband sits back in his chair, hands resting on the polished wood, surveying the room with a quiet intensity. Historians still argue whether the legal power granted to husbands for domestic correction was more performative than practical, or whether it genuinely shaped the day-to-day interactions within the home, but the effects ripple through each gesture and glance. A quirky object draws your attention, a tiny carved owl perched on the edge of a bookshelf, eyes wide and alert. Fringe sources suggest these were not merely decorative, but symbolic watchmen, subtle reminders to household members to adhere to expected conduct. The wife moves through the space with fluid precision, tending the last embers in the hearth, aligning utensils, smoothing cloths, her movements a choreography of attentiveness. Children peek from behind doorways, mimicking her gestures, internalizing the invisible curriculum of obedience, learning the gentle yet firm boundaries that govern the household. Outside, the soft sounds of the night continue, a horse shifting in the distance, the muted clatter of a cart, a dog padding through an empty alley. Scholars still debate whether such legal frameworks reinforce genuine stability or quietly perpetuated tension and fear, but the presence of these rules is felt in every interaction. Across the street, a neighbor's wife quietly nods to another, a subtle acknowledgement of shared knowledge and silent solidarity, a recognition of the invisible threads that weave domestic life together. The scent of smoke from the hearth mingles with the crisp night air, enveloping the home in a sensory blanket that is at once comforting and subtly admonishing. The husband rises to check the door latch, his movements deliberate, eyes sweeping over yard and household alike. The wife completes her chores with quiet efficiency, glancing toward him with measured awareness. Children curl under blankets, practicing the lessons learned through observation, while the household cat slinks silently, tracing the soft boundaries of the room. Every creak, every clink, every gentle sigh threads together law, expectation, and daily rhythm, and as you trudge past these quiet homes under the silvered moonlight, the persistent cadence of authority hums softly, binding the night together in unspoken choreography. A whisper of wind snakes through the narrow streets, carrying the chill of the night, and the faint scent of embers from hearths as you trudge past shuttered homes and silent alleys. The cobblestones glisten with dew, each step echoing softly in the quiet, a reminder of the steady rhythm that governs this colonial world. Inside one home, the husband leans against the corner of the table, hands tracing the grain, eyes quietly scanning the room. Historians still debate whether the allowances for husbands to correct their wives were more symbolic than enforceable, or whether they genuinely dictated the flow of daily life, but their influence permeates each gesture, glance, and routine. A quirky artifact catches your eye, a tiny carved frog perched on a windowsill, its eyes painted with care. Fringe tales suggest such creatures were thought to encourage attentiveness and domestic harmony, a silent nudge toward compliance. The wife moves methodically, tending the last embers of the fire, folding linens, adjusting dishes, each action precise, each motion a language of its own. Children watch from corners, absorbing every movement, learning that even the smallest gestures carry meaning, that every day is threaded with expectation, respect, and a quiet sense of order. Outside, the night hums gently. A distant dog bark, the scrape of a wagon over stone, the muted shuffle of boots on cobbles. Scholars still argue whether these domestic legal frameworks fostered stability or silently imposed tension, yet their presence is palpable. Across the street, a neighbour's wife glances subtly toward another, a quiet signal of shared understanding, a nod to the invisible rules that shape life behind closed doors. The aroma of smoke, dried herbs, and evening bread mingles with the cool air, a sensory tapestry both comforting and quietly instructive. The husband steps toward the door, fingers brushing the frame, eyes sweeping the yard with quiet vigilance. The wife completes her evening tasks, eyes flicking toward him with a practiced balance of awareness and deference. Children settle into bed, embodying lessons learned through careful observation, while the cat prowls silently through shadows, a quiet witness to domestic choreography. Every creak of floorboards, every clink of utensils, every waft of smoke threads law, expectation, and daily routine together. And as you trudge under the moon's gentle gaze, the subtle rhythm of authority whispers softly, threading the night with unbroken, invisible order. Fog drifts low along the streets, curling around lanterns and pooling in the corners of alleys as you trudge past shuttered windows and silent doors. The air smells faintly of wet stone, burning wood, and a lingering sweetness from nearby gardens, blending into the ever-present sense of order that defines each home. Inside one such dwelling, the husband stands near the hearth, hands resting on the mantel, eyes sweeping the room with quiet deliberation. Historians still debate whether the legal latitude for husbands to correct their wives was intended to maintain household stability or to reinforce patriarchal dominance, but its imprint is unmistakable in every glance and gesture. A quirky ornament draws your notice, a tiny, hand-carved squirrel tucked onto a shelf, its bushy tail painted with care. Fringe lore suggests these figures served as silent watchers, encouraging mindfulness and attention to domestic expectations without uttering a single word. The wife moves with careful precision, adjusting the final dishes, folding linens, tending the dying embers, her movements an unspoken dialogue with authority. Children peek from doorways, imitating her gestures with diligent attention, internalizing the rhythms of obedience and understanding that compliance is both subtle and constant. Outside, the world hums quietly. A dog shifts in the shadows, a wagon's wheels scrape over cobblestones, a distant horse snorts in its stall. Scholars still argue whether these domestic laws created genuine stability or simply imposed quiet tension, yet the invisible rules influence every motion and decision. Across the street, a neighbour's wife exchanges a slight nod with another, a small but significant acknowledgement of shared circumstance and silent solidarity, an unspoken agreement within the web of domestic order. The mingling scents of herbs, smoke, and cool night air form a sensory cocoon, soothing yet quietly instructive. The husband steps back from the hearth, eyes sweeping over the yard and room, ensuring everything aligns with his standards. The wife completes her evening tasks, glancing toward him with a practiced balance of awareness and subtle respect. Children nestle into bed, recalling the day's lessons, while the family cat prowls silently among shadows, a quiet participant in this intricate choreography. Every soft creak, every faint clink, every whisper of wind threads together law, expectation, and daily rhythm. And as you trudge beneath the misty glow of lanterns, the persistent cadence of colonial authority hums gently, an invisible guide woven through the night. A thin drizzle begins to fall, lightly tapping the rooftops and cobblestones as you trudge along the deserted streets, the rhythmic patter blending with the faint sigh of the night wind. The air smells of damp earth, smouldering hearths, and the faint sweetness of roses tucked behind window shutters, a sensory cocktail that somehow both soothes and reminds you of the ever-present structure of domestic life. Inside one colonial home, the husband rests his hand on the back of a chair, eyes sweeping over the carefully arranged room, the muted glow of the fire flickering across his stern yet measured face. Historians still debate whether the legal right for husbands to administer domestic correction was intended to protect families or merely to reinforce male dominance, but the behavioral imprint is clear, etched into every glance, gesture, and routine. A quirky object on the mantel draws your eye, a tiny clay turtle, its shell painted with intricate patterns. Fringe tales suggest these were believed to carry patience and longevity into the home, subtle reminders of endurance and careful observation, silently influencing household conduct. The wife moves methodically, extinguishing the last embers in the hearth, folding linens with practiced precision, straightening dishes and utensils in perfect alignment, her every motion a quiet conversation with authority. Children peek from behind doorways, absorbing these rituals, learning that the dance of compliance is woven into even the smallest gestures, and that everyday life is a series of lessons in attentiveness and decorum. Outside, the night hums softly. A distant dog stirs. The wheels of a lone wagon scrape over stone, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze punctuating the silence. Scholars still argue whether these domestic frameworks fostered harmony or simply reinforced tension and quiet fear, yet their presence is felt in every corner of the home. Across the street, a neighbor's wife shares a fleeting glance with another, a subtle sign of solidarity, a quiet acknowledgement of the invisible rules that shape their lives. The aroma of smoke, wet wood, and evening blooms intertwines with the drizzle, creating a comforting, almost hypnotic atmosphere. The husband rises, checking the door and windows with quiet deliberation, hands lingering on the latch, eyes scanning the yard. The wife completes her final chores, glancing toward him with practiced awareness, while children settle beneath blankets, quietly absorbing lessons learned through observation. The family cat prowls the shadows, moving silently, a gentle participant in the choreography of domestic authority. Every creak, every faint clink, every waft of smoke and rain threads law, expectation, and routine into the night. And as you trudge past these dimly lit homes under the soft drizzle, the steady cadence of colonial life hums quietly, persistent and unbroken. A chill drifts through the streets, carrying the scent of wet stone and smouldering hearths as you trudge past shuttered windows and quiet lanes. The moon, pale and thin, casts a muted glow, making cobblestones shimmer faintly, and the occasional lantern flickers, casting shadows that stretch like cautious fingers along walls. Inside a colonial home, the husband sits at the table, hand resting against the carved wood, eyes scanning the room with that quiet intensity that whispers both authority and habit. Historians still argue whether these legal allowances for husbands to discipline wives were truly protective or simply reinforced male dominance, but the echoes of their presence resonate in the rhythms of daily life. On the mantel rests a quirky object, a small, carved hedgehog, its tiny spines meticulously detailed. Fringe accounts suggest such figurines were thought to encourage diligence and attentiveness among household members, a silent nod to the importance of keeping order. The wife moves about the room with careful precision, tending the dying embers of the hearth, folding cloths, aligning dishes, her motions almost like a practiced dance, each gesture communicating understanding and respect. Children peek from doorways, mimicking her movements, learning that every motion, every glance carries meaning within the boundaries set by both law and social expectation. Outside, the night murmurs softly, the distant bark of a dog, the scrape of cartwheels, the low rumble of a horse shifting in its stall. Scholars still debate whether these domestic legal frameworks encouraged stability or quietly imposed tension, yet their presence is palpable in each interaction. Across the street, a neighbor's wife glances briefly at another, a subtle acknowledgement of shared experience and quiet solidarity. The mingling scents of smoke, wet wood, and the faint sweetness of evening blossoms wrap the home in a gentle, instructive cocoon. The husband rises, his movements deliberate, checking the door and windows, ensuring the household aligns with his expectations. The wife completes her final chores, eyes flicking toward him with measured awareness, while children nestle beneath blankets, absorbing lessons learned through observation. The family cat winds silently around furniture, a quiet witness to the rhythm of authority. Every creak, every clink, every whisper of wind and faint tap of rain threads law, expectation, and routine into the night, and as you trudge under the moon's soft glow, the invisible cadence of colonial life hums gently, steady, and unbroken. Mist curls through the streets, dampening cobblestones and softening the edges of lantern light as you trudge along in near-silent anticipation of the night's quiet rituals. The air is dense with the mingled scents of wet earth, smouldering wood, and the subtle sweetness of herbs tucked behind window shutters. Inside one home, the husband leans against the doorway, fingers brushing the frame, eyes sweeping the room with measured attentiveness. Historians still debate whether the legal permission for husbands to correct their wives served more to maintain domestic harmony or to enforce male authority, but the subtle effects are visible in each gesture, glance, and motion within the household. A small curiosity catches your eye, a tiny carved fox poised on a shelf, its expression alert and watchful. Fringe stories claim such figures were believed to ward off misbehavior or misfortune, subtly reminding everyone in the room to maintain proper decorum. The wife moves with careful precision, extinguishing the last embers, folding linens, arranging dishes. Her motions speak to a practiced, almost silent dialogue with authority. Children peek from behind doorways, their eyes wide, internalizing the lessons of attentiveness, understanding that compliance is both subtle and constant, threaded through daily life. Outside, the nocturnal world hums quietly. A distant dog stirs, the scrape of cartwheels, the faint rustle of leaves, all punctuating the soft rhythm of the night. Scholars still argue whether these domestic frameworks fostered genuine stability or quietly imposed tension and silent fear, yet their influence is undeniable. Across the street, a neighbor's wife offers a brief nod to another, a small gesture of solidarity, an unspoken acknowledgement of the invisible rules threading through each home. The intermingled aromas of smoke, wet wood, and evening blooms form a sensory blanket, soothing yet quietly instructive. The husband moves deliberately through the room, hands lingering on furniture, eyes scanning both yard and hearth, ensuring all aligns with his expectations. The wife completes her evening chores, glancing toward him with a practiced balance of attentiveness and deference. Children settle under blankets, absorbing lessons learned through observation, while the family cat prowls silently through shadowed corners, a quiet participant in the domestic choreography. Every creak, faint clink, and whispered sigh threads law, expectation, and daily routine into the night. And as you trudge beneath the misty glow of lanterns, the persistent cadence of colonial authority hums softly, guiding the rhythm of life. The night air grows colder, carrying the faint tang of smoke and the earthy scent of dampened soil as you trudge past quiet homes and shuttered windows. Lanterns flicker, casting elongated shadows that dance along the cobblestones, and the faint sound of water dripping from eaves punctuates the stillness. Inside a colonial dwelling, the husband moves slowly, hands tracing the contours of the table, eyes sweeping the room with the careful vigilance that marks both habit and authority. Historians still argue whether the legal allowance for husbands to correct their wives was ever intended for the protection of the household or simply to assert patriarchal power, yet its imprint is unmistakable, visible in the measured cadence of domestic life. On the mantel sits a tiny ceramic bird, its delicate wings painted with care. Fringe tales suggest these ornaments were considered protectors of attentiveness, silently reminding household members to maintain order and decorum. The wife moves with precise, deliberate steps, tending to the last embers of the hearth folding linens and straightening utensils, her motions a silent conversation with authority. Children peek from corners, eyes wide with curiosity and caution, learning that the subtle rhythms of compliance govern not just chores but the social architecture of the household. Outside, the night whispers. A dog stirs in a distant yard, a wagon wheel scrapes softly over wet cobblestones, and the wind sighs through leafless branches. Scholars still debate whether these domestic legal frameworks nurtured stability or reinforced silent tension, yet their influence permeates every interaction. Across the street, a neighbor's wife glances briefly at another, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding, a quiet alliance under the invisible rules of domestic governance. The aroma of smoke, damp wood, and evening herbs weaves a sensory tapestry, both comforting and instructive. The husband rises deliberately, checking doors and windows, eyes scanning every corner, ensuring that the household aligns with his expectations. The wife completes her final chores, glancing toward him with practiced attentiveness, while children settle beneath blankets, absorbing lessons through quiet observation. The family cat prowls silently, a patient witness to the rhythm of authority. Every creak, faint clink, and gentle whisper of wind threads law, expectation, and daily routine together, and as you trudge under the pale lantern glow, the soft cadence of colonial life hums persistently, invisible yet omnipresent. A soft fog drifts in from the river, curling around chimneys and pooling in the nooks between cobblestones as you trudge along, the muted glow of lanterns reflecting off slick surfaces. The air carries the faint scent of wet earth, smoke from hearths, and a whisper of flowers still clinging stubbornly to their late-season blooms. Inside a colonial home, the husband leans against the doorway, hand resting on the cool wood, eyes sweeping over the carefully arranged room with quiet vigilance. Historians still argue whether the legal latitude allowing husbands to discipline their wives was meant to preserve domestic harmony or simply to reinforce patriarchal authority, but its influence threads every motion, glance, and subtle gesture. On the mantel, a curious miniature owl perches, carved from dark wood and polished to a gentle sheen. Fringe accounts suggest such figures were thought to watch over the household, silently urging mindfulness and caution in daily tasks. The wife moves methodically, tending to the last embers of the hearth, folding linens with practiced precision, straightening dishes, her movements a quiet dialogue with authority. Children peek from doorways, absorbing the lesson that compliance is woven into every gesture, learning the intricate choreography of expectation and habit. Outside, the nocturnal world hums softly. A dog stirs, wagon wheels scrape faintly over wet stones, and leaves rustle in the light wind. Scholars still debate whether these domestic frameworks fostered stability or simply enforced subtle tension and quiet vigilance, yet their presence is unmistakable in the household's rhythm. Across the street, a neighbor's wife shares a fleeting nod with another, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience and understanding, a quiet solidarity beneath the ever-present rules. The scents of smoke, damp wood, and evening blossoms form a comforting sensory cocoon, soothing yet instructive. The husband moves deliberately through the room, hands tracing furniture edges, eyes scanning yard and hearth alike. The wife completes her chores, glancing toward him with practiced awareness, while children settle beneath blankets, absorbing lessons from observation alone. The family cat prowls silently through shadowed corners, a quiet participant in the rhythm of authority. Every creak, faint clink, and soft sigh of wind threads law, expectation, and routine into the night. And as you trudge beneath the misty lantern glow, the gentle cadence of colonial life hums softly, persistent and unbroken. A pale mist lingers over the cobblestones, softening the edges of lantern light and turning the quiet streets into a dreamy blur as you trudge along, the night heavy with the mingled scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and lingering herbs. Inside a colonial home, the husband moves with quiet deliberation, hand resting on the back of a chair, eyes sweeping the room with a careful, practiced vigilance. Historians still argue whether the legal permission for husbands to correct their wives was a genuine effort to maintain household order or simply a codified reinforcement of patriarchal control, but the traces of its influence thread through every corner, gesture, and glance. A small carved squirrel perches on the mantel, its bushy tail etched with meticulous detail. Fringe stories suggest such objects were believed to instill attentiveness and carefulness in the household, tiny guardians of propriety. The wife tends the dying embers of the hearth, folds linens, arranges dishes, her every motion a silent negotiation with authority. Children peek from doorways, absorbing the choreography of behavior, learning that subtle compliance is woven into daily life and that even small gestures carry weight. Outside, the night whispers, a dog stirs, wagon wheels scrape faintly over stone, and the wind rustles the leaves with a gentle rhythm. Scholars still debate whether these domestic legal frameworks fostered genuine stability or quietly imposed tension and quiet anxiety, yet their presence is palpable. Across the street, a neighbor's wife offers a fleeting nod to another, a small acknowledgement of shared experience, a quiet solidarity under the invisible rules governing their homes. The mingling scents of smoke, wet wood, and evening blooms wrap the household in a calming, instructive embrace. The husband checks doors and windows with deliberate care, hands lingering on furniture edges, eyes scanning yard and room alike. The wife completes her final tasks, glancing toward him with measured attentiveness, while children settle beneath blankets, learning through quiet observation. The family cat prowls silently through shadowed corners, a patient witness to the rhythm of authority. Every creak, faint clink, and whisper of wind threads lure expectation and routine into the night, and as you trudge beneath the misty glow of lanterns, the steady cadence of colonial life hums softly, persistent and unbroken. The night has deepened, the fog thickening over cobblestones and spilling into alleyways, softening the lantern glow to a hazy warmth as you trudge along, each step muffled by the damp stones. Inside a colonial home, the husband moves deliberately through the dimly lit room, hands brushing the furniture with careful precision, eyes sweeping over every corner with an authority that feels both practiced and invisible. Historians still argue whether the legal latitude for husbands to correct their wives was ever intended to protect the household or merely codify male dominance. Yet the invisible weight of that law threads through every gesture and glance. On the mantel, a carved tortoise sits, its shell etched with intricate patterns. Fringe accounts suggest such figures were thought to encourage patience and careful attention within the household, subtle reminders of the social choreography expected each day. The wife tends the last embers of the hearth, folds linens with quiet exactness, arranges utensils, and moves through her tasks with a rhythm that is both silent and deliberate. Children, tucked beneath blankets, watch from doorways, learning that the unspoken rules of conduct are as much a part of the home as fire and wood, shadows and scent. Outside, the world hums quietly, the faint bark of a dog, the distant creak of a cartwheel, and the whisper of wind through trees and chimneys. Scholars still debate whether these domestic frameworks fostered true stability or quietly imposed tension and silent obedience, yet their effect is undeniable. Across the street, a neighbor's wife shares a fleeting nod with another, a small gesture of shared understanding and quiet solidarity. The mingled aromas of smoke, wet wood, and late-season blooms weave a sensory cocoon that is soothing yet instructive, wrapping the household in a calm, steady rhythm. The husband makes a final check of doors and windows, hands lingering on edges, eyes scanning yard and room alike. The wife completes her last chores, glancing toward him with practiced awareness, while children absorb lessons through observation alone. The family cat winds silently through shadowed corners, a quiet witness to the evening's choreography of authority and obedience. Every creak, faint clink and whisper of wind threads law, expectation, and routine into the night, and as you trudge beneath the misty lantern glow, the cadence of colonial life hums softly, persistent and unbroken, carrying the quiet weight of centuries along with it. Now the night softens further. Imagine the fog gradually lifting, leaving a gentle hush over cobblestones. Lanterns flicker one last time, shadows fading into quiet warmth. Smoke curls lazily from the hearth, mingling with the faint scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. Children are asleep. The wife finally rests, and the husband sits, his hands unclenched for the first time in hours. All is still. Remember, the patterns of law and authority, once so rigid and tangible, now drift into history, leaving only echoes and lessons. You can breathe. You can let go. The quiet rhythm of the past fades into soft whispers. Every creak, every sigh, every shadow becomes gentle, almost like a lullaby. The night is calm, the air cool, the lanterns dim. Let your eyes rest, your mind wander slowly along the soft contours of history. You are safe. The world has slowed. Time itself seems to yawn. And as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the distant lanterns fading, the houses breathing quietly, and the fog dissolving into the calm of early morning.